Imagine waking up one morning and finding hospital beds where your dining table used to be. Imagine soldiers lying in the very rooms where you once hosted grand dinner parties. Imagine the chandeliers that once lit up laughing. Well-dressed guests now casting light over men with bandaged arms and broken spirits. That is exactly what happened to Downton Abbey. One day it was one of the most beautiful and powerful estates in all of England, full of silver cutlery, pressed suits, and a strict order that had existed for generations. And then, almost overnight, the war changed everything. The grand rooms were emptied, the fine furniture was carried out, and in its place came rows of beds, the smell of medicine, and the quiet groans of men who had seen things no human being should ever have to see. But here is the thing that makes this story so powerful. The people of Downton, the family upstairs and the servants downstairs, did not fall apart. They adapted, they sacrificed, and in doing so, they discovered something about themselves that years of dinner parties and fox hunts never could have taught them. This is the story of how a house became a hospital, and how that hospital changed everything. To truly understand what Downton losing its identity meant, you first have to understand what Downton was. Downton Abbey was not just a house. It was not just a building with pretty walls and tall windows. It was a living, breathing world. A world that had its own rules, its own rhythm, and its own very particular sense of order. Every single thing that happened inside those walls happened for a reason, at a specific time, in a specific way. And everyone who lived or worked there knew exactly where they stood. Upstairs, the Crawley family moved through their days with a kind of quiet confidence that only comes from generations of wealth and title. Lord Robert Crawley, the Earl of Grantham, sat at the head of it all. Not a cruel man, not an arrogant man, but a man who believed deeply in the way things were. He believed in tradition. He believed in duty. He believed that Downton Abbey stood for something bigger than just one family, that it represented a way of life worth protecting. His wife, Cora, was an American woman who had married into the English aristocracy and, over the years, had grown to love it just as deeply as any woman born into it. She was warm and gracious, and she managed the social life of Downton with a gentle but firm hand. She understood the house, she understood her husband, and she understood the responsibility that came with living the way they lived. Then there were the daughters Mary, Edith, and Sybil, 3 young women, each completely different from the other, all growing up inside a world that was slowly becoming too small for them. Mary was sharp and proud, carrying herself with a kind of cool elegance that made people both admire and fear her. Edith was softer, often overlooked, quietly searching for her place in a family where she always seemed to come second. And Sybil, bright, warm, restless. Sybil was already beginning to look beyond the walls of Downton toward a world that felt more honest and more real. And then there was downstairs. If upstairs was the face of Downton Abbey, then downstairs was its heartbeat. Mr. Carson, the butler, ran the household staff with the same seriousness that a general might run an army. To Carson, Downton was not just a place of employment. It was his life's purpose. Every polished candlestick, every perfectly folded napkin, every meal served at exactly the right temperature was a reflection of his personal standard. He did not simply work at Downton. He was Downton, in many ways. Mrs. Hughes, the housekeeper, stood beside him as his equal in all but title, a steady, sensible woman whose quiet strength kept the household running even when everything else around her was uncertain. Together, Carson and Mrs. Hughes represented the backbone of the estate. Without them, the whole elegant structure would have quietly fallen apart. Below them worked the footmen, the maids, the cook, the ladies' maids, each person in their place, each person with a role, each person part of a machine that had been running smoothly for decades. They worked long hours. They lived in small rooms. They gave their days entirely to the service of a family that most of them genuinely cared for, even if that care was rarely spoken out loud. This was Downton Abbey before the war. A place of beauty, yes, but more than that, a place of deep, unspoken meaning. A place where everyone knew who they were and what was expected of them. A place that felt, to all who lived and worked within it, like it would go on forever, exactly as it was. But history has a way of walking through even the grandest front doors without knocking. Nobody rang a bell. Nobody sent a formal notice. The war did not arrive at Downton Abbey with a dramatic knock at the front door. It crept in slowly at first, like a cold draft through an old window, and then all at once, It was everywhere. It was the summer of 1914 when the world that the Crawley family had always known began to crack at its edges. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, and within weeks, the whole of Europe was pulling itself apart. Countries were declaring war on each other like dominoes, falling one after another. And Britain, proud and powerful Britain, stepped forward as it always had, with its chest out and its flag raised, and entered the fight. For most people living inside the walls of Downton Abbey, the war felt distant at first. It was something happening out there, across the channel, in muddy fields and foreign cities whose names were hard to pronounce. Life at Downton continued its familiar rhythm. Meals were still served at the proper hour. The family still dressed for dinner. Carson still inspected every glass for spots before it reached the table. But underneath that surface calm, something was shifting. The young men began to disappear first. That is how it always starts with war. The young men go. The footmen who had stood so straight and proud at the dining room doors started handing in their notice one by one. William, young and eager and full of a patriotic fire that only the truly young can feel, was among the first to want to go. He did not see the mud or the blood or the cold when he thought about the war. He saw honor. He saw purpose. He saw a chance to be something greater than a footman at a grand house in Yorkshire, and he was not alone. Across England, young men from houses just like Downton were making the same choice, trading their uniforms of service for the uniform of a soldier. The households that had run like clockwork for decades suddenly found themselves short-handed, off balance, and quietly anxious about a future they could not yet see clearly. Downton. Lord Grantham felt the pull of war perhaps more personally than anyone. Here was a man whose entire identity was built around duty to his family, duty to his estate, duty to his class and his country. When war came calling, Robert Crawley did not hide behind the comfort of his title. He wanted to serve. He needed to serve. To do anything less would have felt, to him, like a betrayal of everything he believed in. The idea of sitting safely in his grand dining room while other men's sons were dying in French fields was something he simply could not make peace with. But Robert's path was not straightforward. He was not a young man anymore. And the British Army, as it turned out, had very particular ideas about where aging earls could be most useful. And it was not on the front lines. This quiet rejection cut Robert deeply. A man defined by duty, told he was not needed in the way he most wanted to give it. It was a wound that had no bandage, and it would shape everything he did in the months that followed. Meanwhile, the women of Downton were facing their own reckoning for generations. Women like Cora and Mary and Edith had lived lives carefully arranged around social visits, charitable luncheons, and the very serious business of making a good marriage. The war did not simply disrupt that world. It exposed how fragile it had always been. Suddenly, the things that had seemed so important, who sat next to whom at dinner, which family had the better bloodline, whether a dress was appropriate for a Tuesday afternoon, all of it felt thin and hollow against the backdrop of what was happening just across the water. Sybil felt this most acutely of all. She had always been the one most restless within Downton's gilded boundaries, the one who asked questions that made the older generation shift uncomfortably in their chairs. When the war came, it did not frighten Sybil. It called to her. She did not want to sit and knit socks for soldiers, as was considered the proper contribution for a young woman of her standing. She wanted to do something real, something that mattered, something that put her hands and her energy to actual use. The seed of an idea was already growing in her mind, one that would eventually lead her far from the drawing room and into a world her family could barely imagine for her. And then there was Violet, the Dowager Countess, sitting perfectly upright in her chair, as she always did, watching the world change around her with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Violet had lived through enough history to know that wars reshaped everything they touched. She had seen comfort become hardship before. She had watched the familiar become unrecognizable. And while she faced it all with her trademark sharp wit and unshakable composure, even Violet could not entirely hide the shadow that passed across her face when she truly understood what was coming for the house she loved. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a house when everything inside it is about to change. Not the comfortable silence of a peaceful evening, not the soft quiet of a sleeping household, but a heavy, holding its breath kind of silence, the kind that fills a room just before something irreversible happens. That was the silence that settled over Downton Abbey. The morning the decision was made, it did not come as a sudden announcement. It did not arrive with a dramatic speech or a formal declaration. It came the way most life-changing decisions come, gradually, through a series of quiet conversations, uncomfortable realizations, and moments where the right thing to do became impossible to argue against. No matter how much some people wanted to try, the proposal was straightforward in its logic. Even if it was anything but simple in its meaning, Downton Abbey was large. It had more rooms than most families could ever use. It had space and running water and grounds wide enough to give recovering men fresh air and room to breathe. Wounded soldiers were coming back from the front lines in numbers that the existing hospitals simply could not handle. Men who had survived the worst that war could throw at them were now lying in overcrowded wards, lacking the proper care and the peaceful environment that real recovery required. Downton could provide that. Downton should provide that. Cora was the one who saw it first, or at least, she was the one who said it out loud first. And that matters, because saying a thing out loud in a house like Downton was often the hardest part. Cora had always possessed a clarity that cut through the fog of tradition and expectation. She was not a woman who confused the way things had always been done with the way things ought to be done. When she looked at the empty guest rooms and the wide unused corridors of Downton, she did not see heritage to be protected. She saw beds that could hold healing men. She saw space that could save lives. Robert's reaction was exactly what anyone who knew him would have predicted. He struggled, deeply and genuinely struggled. And it would be unfair and too simple to call that struggle mere selfishness or pride, because it was neither of those things entirely. Robert's resistance came from a place that was far more complicated, a place built from generations of belief that Downton Abbey represented, something that could not simply be rearranged or repurposed without losing something essential. To Robert, the house was not just walls and rooms. It was identity. It was legacy. It was the physical proof that his family had stood for something, generation after generation, and that they would continue to stand for it long after he was gone. The thought of that being dismantled, even temporarily, even for the most honorable of reasons, felt to him like a kind of quiet death. But Robert Crawley was also, at his core, a man of duty. And duty, when it spoke loudly enough, had always been the one thing capable of overriding everything else in him. The war was real. The wounded soldiers were real. The need was undeniable. And so, slowly, painfully, with the particular grace of a man swallowing something bitter because he knows it is the right medicine, Robert said yes. And with that yes, Downton Abbey began to die and be reborn at the same time. What followed was nothing short of extraordinary to witness. The transformation of Downton from a family estate into a convalescent home was not a gentle or romantic process. It was physical and disruptive, and for many of the people who lived and worked there, quietly heartbreaking in ways they could not always find the words for. The furniture went first. Generations of carefully chosen, lovingly maintained furniture, chairs that had seated earls and ambassadors, tables that had held banquets for the most important people in England, were carried out of the grand rooms and moved into storage. Every piece that left felt like a small removal of the house's soul. The footmen who carried them out did so with an efficiency that masked whatever they were feeling inside. Because that was what you did at Downton. You kept your feelings neat and tucked away. Just like the linen, in their place came the beds. Plain, functional, iron-framed hospital beds that had no interest in the history of the rooms they were placed in. They did not care that this had once been the library where Lord Grantham read after dinner, or that this corridor had echoed with the laughter of children at Christmas. They were there to do a job. And watching them arrive, watching them be carried through the same doors that had once admitted dukes and diplomats was, for many of the household, the moment the reality of what was happening truly landed. Carson watched all of it with the expression of a man attending a funeral he had not been given enough time to prepare for. Every bed that replaced a piece of fine furniture was, to Carson, a small act of violence against the order he had spent his entire working life constructing and protecting. He did not say this, of course. Carson rarely said the things he felt most deeply. Instead, he stood straighter, pressed his lips together just a fraction tighter, and continued doing his job with the same rigid professionalism that had always defined him. Because if the house was going to change, then at least the standards of the people serving it would not. Mrs. Hughes, characteristically, was more practical about it. She had always been the kind of woman who understood that life required bending without breaking. She organized. She redirected. She took the chaos of transition and quietly shaped it into something workable, assigning new duties, rearranging routines, keeping the household moving forward even as the household itself was being fundamentally redefined around her. The day the soldiers arrived, everything became real, not the idea of it, not the polite discussions over breakfast about duty and sacrifice and the war effort, the actual, physical, undeniable reality of it. Walking through the front doors of Downton Abbey on its own defeat, or being carried through on a stretcher, or limping forward on a crutch with eyes that had seen things that no amount of Yorkshire countryside could ever fully erase. They came in groups. Young men, most of them startlingly young, the kind of young that makes you catch your breath when you realize they are the same age as the footmen who used to stand at the dining room doors. They came wrapped in bandages and wearing the particular expression that men carry when they have been through something they cannot yet speak about. Some of them looked around at the grandeur of Downton with wide, disbelieving eyes. They had grown up in terraced houses and farm cottages and cramped city flats. They had never stood on marble floors or looked up at ceilings painted with elaborate designs. They had never been anywhere like this in their lives, and now this place, this impossibly grand, impossibly beautiful place, was going to be their home while they healed, for the Crawley family. The arrival of the soldiers was the moment that theory became practice. It is one thing to agree, in the abstract, to open your home. It is quite another to stand in your own hallway and watch strangers, working-class strangers, men from a completely different world being guided into the rooms where your family has lived for generations. The collision of those two realities happening in real time, in real space, was something that no amount of preparation could have fully cushioned. Robert stood and watched that first morning with an expression that was carefully composed, but not entirely successful at hiding what was underneath it. There was conflict in his face, genuine, honest conflict between the man who believed in duty and the man who loved his home with every fiber of his being. He shook hands where hands were extended. He nodded with the quiet dignity that was his natural mode. But when he turned away and walked toward the window that overlooked the grounds, the set of his shoulders told a story his face was trying not to tell. Cora moved through it all differently. She had always been more comfortable with the human side of things than Robert, more naturally at ease with people outside her own social circle, more instinctively capable of seeing a person rather than a position. She spoke to the arriving soldiers with a warmth that was not performed or patronizing. She asked their names. She remembered them. She made them feel, as much as was possible in those first disorienting hours, that they were welcome, genuinely welcome in this enormous and unfamiliar place. It was a small thing. But for men who had spent months being treated as bodies to be deployed rather than people to be valued, it was not a small thing at all. Downstairs, the reaction was its own complicated landscape. The remaining servants found themselves navigating entirely new territory, both physically and emotionally. Their routines had already been disrupted by the transformation of the rooms. Now the rooms were filled with people who represented a world that the servants themselves had more in common with than the family they served. And yet the dynamic was strange and unfamiliar in ways that were difficult to articulate. Carson, to no one's surprise, drew his lines clearly and early. The standards of Downton would be maintained. The soldiers would be treated with respect and given proper care. But the house would not descend into disorder simply because its purpose had changed. He was not unkind about it. Carson was rarely unkind, but he was firm in the way that only a man deeply committed to a particular vision of the world can be firm, with a kind of earnest rigidity that was both his greatest strength and, at times, his greatest limitation.